I've been covering national security for 12 years, 12 long years. When I started, it was kind of obvious what it was. It was primarily covering terrorism and covering the work of the intelligence agencies, spies. Then maybe about 7 years ago, this thing called cyber started to emerge, and it started to take up more and more of my time. A bit marginal at first, then grew up to maybe being half of my time as we started to report more and more on it. And I don't know if Troy is still here, but I apologise if I ever used a hoodie or a 1 and a 0 or a green screen in a report, but you come and try and make a piece of TV about hackers without doing that, and give it a try. We'll swap jobs for a day. But then something interesting has happened in the last year or two, actually, because from cyber security being over here and the kind of terrorism and intelligence world being over here, it's all started to merge into a bit of an unholy mess. 3 examples, quick examples of how it's merged. The first would be encryption was once this very technical specialist issue. Then suddenly a battle between Apple and the FBI over encryption gets onto the news because it's a terrorist iPhone. Second example, a British hacker gets involved with ISIS and gets taken out in a drone strike in Syria, Junaid Hussain. That's like the plot of a thriller, and it happened. Third example, a French TV channel gets hacked, gets taken offline, gets close to being destroyed. A message goes up on the screen saying a cyber caliphate was responsible. In fact, it turns out to be Russian hackers. 3 examples of the way in which the world of kind of counter-terrorism, traditional security, cyber security, technology has all merged in what I do now. When it started to kind of rise up as an issue, I wanted to find out where it started. I wanted to find out what the origins were of it, because I like history. And that's why I wrote the book. And I tried to understand where it all came from. And if I had a simple message which came out of the book, it was that the computer was born to spy. The computer was born to spy. What do I mean by that? 2 things. First of all, that the first computer, the one that I think was the first computer, the first semi-programmable computer, Colossus, built at Bletchley Park, was built to aid spying, to aid code breaking, to help with that process. But more importantly, that computers generally, and particularly network computers, are inherently useful for and vulnerable to espionage. And the point of that story and the history is to say that there is an interwoven history between computers and intelligence over the last 60, 70 years. And it's a history which matters for us and for all of us going forward. I won't dwell on the history, you'll be pleased to know. Although I think there are a couple of very quick points which I think are interesting from the history, partly to say that a lot of things that we think are new and that are talked of new in this field aren't really new. The debate about going dark and encryption is old. If you were in the intelligence agencies, it happened in 1940 when Enigma got upgraded. It happened in 1948 when the Soviets upgraded their codes and they feared going dark. It happened in the 90s. Big data, again, when the intelligence agencies went dark in the late 40s, they turned to data. The idea of big data, which is taking in vast amounts of information, looking for what's normal, looking for anomalies, looking for changes, that's something that spy agencies pioneered in the Cold War, using vast amounts of data about Soviet communications to look for patterns, to extract meanings, precisely because they couldn't break the codes. Computer security, cyber security, first emerged in the early 60s. I found one person who I think was one of the earliest to be involved, an Air Force captain called Roger Shell, who worked for the US Air Force, and looked into the fact that nuclear-tipped missiles stationed in the United States were controlled by computers, and he feared they could be subverted and turned back to fire back into the US, and started examining that danger. And he ended up being involved in something very interesting called the Anderson Report in 1972, which, if you read, is still really the template of all modern cybersecurity in terms of its analysis of what computer security vulnerabilities are. So around that time also the internet emerged. Key point about that, which for the history, which matters for now, is that the internet was born to share and not to secure. It was built as a network for academics, for a group of trusted peers to share their information, share computing time, and with no understanding that it would scale up to what it is now. And of course the fact it's a dumb network which you can do smart things with, is exactly why it grew so fast, but it built in, it hardwired in this insecurity. And so you start to get cyber espionage from the 80s. Once information is on the internet, people try and steal it. So again, cyber espionage, very, very old. First case, late 80s. Many of you will know the story of Cuckoo's Egg, is the book by Cliff Stoll about it, when a group of West German hackers walked into the KGB mission in East Berlin and offered access to US military secrets in return for $1 million, which I always imagine they said in a kind of Austin Powers voice. Well, $1 million. No evidence they actually did that, but they did provide some secrets. And then you started to see cyber espionage pick up pace. KGB first, Britain and America started in the 90s. China joined on a large scale in the late 90s. Then we had, after 9/11, this data-driven hunt for terrorists. In America after 9/11, particularly here after 7/7, which Sir David Omans has talked about, and so I won't go into that. But I do want to talk about human intelligence, because I think this is interesting and less talked about. Human spies. This is the world of trying to get secrets from people, from agents who might be in another country and have access to secrets that you want to get hold of. A couple of months ago, I went to the CIA, to Langley, for a reporting trip to interview the Deputy Director, Andrew Horman, who's their Deputy Director for Technological Transformation. And it was very interesting because down the corridor from where he works is the CIA's in-house museum. It's not open to the public, sadly, but it is filled with artifacts from the CIA's past. One of the things you see when you go down there is how intrinsic technology has actually been to human espionage. You see some of the earliest photocopiers, which were developed there to copy documents very fast when they've been taken out of a safe, perhaps. They needed to be returned quickly. Very early cameras, very early bugging devices. So technology has always been quite intrinsic and essential to the world of human espionage. But if you talk to people like Andrew Horman today and his counterparts in Britain, which I did for that article, then what you get a sense of is that there is an existential battle going on for spy agencies and for human spy agencies to cope with data and technology. It is challenging their work, and they know it places quite high risks on their ability to carry on their work. Why? Well, on the one hand, data can be a huge enabler for what they do. Even if the basis of recruiting a spy is human-to-human contact, now that is driven by data. Understanding who might have access to secrets, say, in a nuclear program. Well, you might find that out by analysing a database of what engineers work on that program. Finding out someone who you might want to approach, you'll do that through data sets. What kind of person are they? How are you going to approach them? That is done by maybe looking at their social media profile, the trail they lead. Working out where they're going to be, where you might be able to approach them. Again, that can be done through data analytics, sometimes open source, sometimes covert methods. All of that data will surround the work of human intelligence to try and meet a target who a case officer might try and recruit. But then data can also be a challenge, because think about it this way. If you are that case officer who is going to approach someone, say in a hotel room in Dubai, all the techniques of data analytics can be used against you. In the old days, you would have been able to pick up a false passport, walk out the door, and just assume an identity. How does that work in the age of biometrics and biometric databases, the world of unique identifiers? How does that work in the age in which you leave a digital trail, an exhaust, a data exhaust from everything you do? How do you maintain your cover if you're undercover, if you operate in a modern world where you're expected to have a social media profile? How do you build a legend, a cover over time in that kind of world? They ran a test a few years ago about how long it would take a suspicious person to work out how long, whether someone might be who they really were or might be undercover. And it took about a minute on Google to work out that someone in the past wasn't who they were. And a lot of investment and thought has gone into trying to work out how to adapt to this data-driven world. And what that tells you is that the ability of spies to keep secrets is being challenged. And the people who worry most, interestingly enough, about the kind of digital exhaust and data and privacy are privacy advocates and spies. And the two people who often clash, actually the two people who worry most about what the data exhaust and the digital trail that we leave can tell you about people's lives. And it does pose quite an existential challenge for the intelligence agencies. Technology is transforming intelligence in a few other interesting ways. One of the things the Americans, the CIA, are pioneering is big data analytics to predict events, to look for sentiment analysis. Again, open source information largely, but trying to aggregate it and understand it to predict when something like the Arab Spring might be able to break out. Not necessarily what day, but that looking at patterns and data to understand when major changes might be able to take place. It's also changed the world of covert action, of sabotage, the James Bond world as well. I always think a good analogy of that is that during the Second World War, when Britain was worried about the Germans getting hold of heavy water to use in an atomic weapons program, they had to parachute in a group of operatives into Norway to blow up the plant. And one of them is still alive. I interviewed him recently, a guy called Joachim Ronnenberg. He's in his 90s now. He's an amazing guy. And he was parachuted in, satchel full of explosives, laid the explosives there, blew up, and then he had to ski away from an entire German division. And he describes it as the best skiing weekend he ever had, in that very low-key Norwegian way. And you think, yeah. Of course, 70 years later, when there were worries about the Iranian nuclear program, what did they do? Well, rather than having to parachute someone in, they used Stuxnet. The US and Israel as well, it's thought, used Stuxnet to do almost exactly the same thing, carry out an act of sabotage to slow it down. Very interesting that Stuxnet cyber attack, but also some of the iterations at least required people, because they required a person, wittingly or unwittingly, to put a USB stick in a machine, which again suggests that human and cyber espionage are much closer and much more closely intertwined than we normally think about. You can also see that shift in the way other countries use it. Russia's been in the news a lot about this. Active measures, influence operations, are something the KGB used to do in the Cold War to try and influence politics in countries. It's something clearly they can try and do now, allegedly, according to the US administration, using the release of data from the Democratic Party to try and influence politics. But cyber and technology allows them to do it on a transformative scale. I think it's very interesting the way in which Russia appears to have very adeptly integrated cyber into what they call hybrid warfare, this kind of near warfare in which it's somewhere between war and peace, and in which it's not separate, cyber's not some separate thing you do, it's very closely integrated into what they would be doing in places like Ukraine and other forms of information warfare, destabilization, and military action. It's an example, really, of how cyber and technology is being integrated into other forms. And that French TV attack, I think, was very interesting as an example of how far the Russians, if it was the Russians, that's what the French think, were willing to go to push the boundaries of what they're willing to do to take down a TV channel, very close to destroying it, and then try and false flag it to the cyber caliphate. So this shift in which I think the days in which we see cyber espionage and espionage are gone, because all espionage, or most of it, will involve a degree of cyber and technology warfare, cyber warfare. I think that distinction will be gone. It'll all be part of one thing, maybe even terrorism and cyber terrorism. We haven't really seen it yet. Why does this all matter for all of us? Let me just make a couple of quick points on that, because I think this, this sounds like it's all about spies, but I do think it matters for all of us, because the technology of espionage has been commoditized, commercialized, democratized. It's proliferating. You can buy spyware now. You can buy tracking devices. You can buy malware off the shelf, pretty high-end malware off the shelf. You can do things which in the past only an intelligence agency would be able to do. Even the kinds of searches you can do on open source media that Cameron was talking about this morning, the kind of research, the kind of analysis, is the kind of things which in the past only a spy agency, an intelligence agency, or a government would be able to do. This is now something that's open for everyone to be able to do. We move to the Internet of Things, as we've heard. It will be an Internet of Things to spy on and to be used to spy on us. Cybersecurity as well. The trend that we heard about again this morning about the fears and the insecurity driven by cybersecurity move us towards greater monitoring, greater surveillance, looking for insider threats, doing pattern of life we heard earlier today. It's the kind of thing intelligence agencies have done in the past, pattern of life analysis, what looks normal. It's quite an intrusive degree of surveillance about employees involved in doing that. How do people feel about that in terms of their privacy and employees having their behaviour and their online behaviour checked? I think that's something people will have to think about. And I think the role of the private sector in data collection, are people really willing, and how willing are they to be tracked for that 10% discount? Are they really willing? Do they think of it as okay to have their shopping habits tracked, have their movements geolocated so that when they walk into a particular shop they get a 10% discount? Is that surveillance? Is that monitoring? Is that spying? I think our whole notions of what constitutes spying and surveillance are being challenged. Our whole notion of what constitutes secrecy and privacy are under pressure and are being challenged and are going to have to change. Our ability, this takes me finally back to spies, to keep secrets is being challenged. Everyone's ability. Spies are finding it harder to keep secrets, but so is everyone else. Whether you're GCHQ and the NSA over Snowden, whether you're someone whose tax affairs are now out because of the Panama Papers, whether you're on Ashley Madison, whether you're on one of Troy's databases, everyone's ability to keep secrets is being challenged, and I think our notions of what privacy and security and secrecy are going to have to change and adapt to that, because it is going to change. And so I think, to close, I think the secret history of computers and spies may well be a future in which there are no secrets and in which we are all spies and in which we're all spied on. Thank you.
And you're a reporter, Gordon, so you have no opinions, but I'm going to tease out
Go on, try.
an opinion. Does it worry you?
Yes. So I am impartial, obviously. So I have no views. This is the disclaimer, because I work at the BBC. I'm entirely impartial. But I suppose what worries me is the idea that people, the general public, don't often debate some of this enough and understand some of this enough. And that technology moves so fast, it moves faster than our ability as journalists sometimes to convey it to people. Norms get established often without public consent and without debate, whether it's by the state or whether it's by the private sector, in kind of what kinds of data can be collected and how it's used. And it's done without much public understanding. That's arguably what happened with intelligence agencies in the past. I think it's happening in lots of ways now. So what worries me, I think, is how we explain to people what technology is doing and what is happening with their data.
But I've tried to stimulate these discussions as a journalist. I used to write a tech column in the Times, and I did an op-ed probably 14 years ago when RFID tags were starting to come down in price. And the headline for one of those is, watch out, your pullover could be tracking you with one of these devices. And I realised nobody cared, especially anybody under 30.
Yeah.
So is this idea of privacy just a short 20th century phenomenon that is going to become irrelevant?
And that's what I think is really interesting, are there generational shifts about privacy? Are there generational shifts about what people are willing to trade their privacy for, whether it's national security or whether it's convenience and that discount when you go shopping? Will that change over time, or will those norms get established and they'll change and our past conceptions of privacy are just gone and we just have to deal with it? I think, events may change people's views, and I think, we're starting to see some cybersecurity breaches with consequence, which might change our view of cybersecurity. I think we will see more privacy breaches, which may change and reawaken people's kind of concern about that. So I'm not convinced that it's as simple as saying it's gone, it's over, that's that.
Final question. You've reported on implications of the Snowden revelations of WikiLeaks, and you've also reported on information tribunals saying the authorities have gone a bit too far. So David Omand was making the case that putting everything under rule of law will solve this issue. Are you convinced?
I think the issue for me is everything that is now being done will be put under rule of law, but the nature of technological change means we can't predict what it will be possible to do with technology in 5 years. What you can do by aggregating data in interesting ways, what you'll be able to find out about people, what new technologies and IoT might allow us to do in the state to do in terms of data collection. Is the current legislation going to be capable of dealing with that future, or is the risk, if we don't revisit it, that stuff just starts happening again, as happened in the past, without public understanding and consent?
Could be your pullover tracking you. Thank you very much, Gordon Corera.